Be seated, please. Just have a seat, Doctor. You continue under oath. You understand that?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Two things, Doctor. Would you just a little bit away from the microphone, just a little bit. And the other thing is, the court reporter asked me to ask you to slow down just a little bit.
I'll try.
And she'll signal me if you're going too fast, and I'll tell you slow down.
Okay, I apologize if I'm speaking too quickly.
When we left at the noon hour, I asked you to give us an explanation of the concept of paraphilia, and you completed that answer by talking about partners and things being part of the arousal.
Yes, sir.
What are the essential elements of any paraphilic disorder according to the DSM-3R?
Well, again, I think I may have answered it, but I can repeat it. I think I made the point that it talked about intense, recurrent, erotically or sexually arousing fantasies and urges. And then I said you would specify about what, and pedophilia about children, and necrophilia about scenarios involving dead bodies and so on.
Now, what is the central theme of Mr. Dahmer's paraphilic disorder?
Well, I mentioned that the name that I'm giving it is necrophilia. The central theme that seems to exist in terms of his particular situation is that he has fantasies and urges about having initial sexual contact with someone while they're alive. He then fantasizes and imagines continuing on in a sexualized and intimate relationship in a transition state that's sort of between life and death. At times he's called it a zombie-like state and has referred to other things. And then continues to fantasize about, and tragically has enacted fantasies where he continues then to relate to the body of the person after death, caressing them, kissing them, having sexual involvements, even continuing with parts of the anatomy in the body, and even, as I think people probably know, consuming the body with a sense of somehow in his disturbed thinking this will sustain and continue on the relationship even beyond death.
Have you ever seen one like this before?
No, sir, not exactly like this. I have seen other people with a diagnosis of necrophilia, but obviously this is a terribly gruesome and serious situation. I certainly haven't seen anything anywhere near being exactly like this.
Give us some examples of how that theme was expressed.
Well, again, I think much of that is out already. It was expressed at times in a partial fashion. For example, there were times when he would go to bathhouses and would put drugs into the drinks of people and have them in this kind of sleep-like state where it didn't go any further, so it was a partial expression. It was expressed in a more complete form, tragically, where he actually would be continuing to be intimate with the bodies of people whose lives he had taken. There was a time in his life where I think he was really struggling extremely hard to keep himself from being overpowered by these fantasies and urges, where it was expressed in ways that were a bit different than what we see later on. There was one time, for example, where he had read about somebody having died, and an obituary column actually went to a funeral parlor to view the body, and then was planning to try to dig up the body in order to obtain a body in that fashion. At a time when I believe he had only killed the one person in Ohio. There were years there where he was really fighting this, and so that was a way of trying to deal with this, to get a body without the killings. There was another time in that same vein where he actually took a mannequin from a store, took it to his grandmother's house, and was relating in a sexual and intimate way with the mannequin, again during this time when he seemed to be struggling to keep the thing from progressing further. I can give you others, but those are some examples of how the theme is expressed. Perhaps one more, because I did emphasize the transition state between life and death. And then again, I know there are families, and I apologize for having to get into this, but there were some folks, as you know, who he had sex with while they were alive, had gotten them into this sleep state, and then actually drilled holes in their head in order to try to sustain that transition period between life and death. That was another awful expression of the kinds of sick fantasies and urges that I believe afflict this particular individual.
Now, you understand that the jury has had read to it a very, very extensive confession given by Mr. Dahmer to the police over a period of about 60 hours. And you likewise have met with him and have taken statements from him, correct?
That's correct.
And other material has also been furnished to you in preparation for your work on this case, correct?
Yeah, yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay. When you may be telling the jury some things that they haven't heard yet, so I'm going to ask you the source of the information concerning Mr. Dahmer's attempt to create and to do some surgical processes with some of his victims. Was that told to you by him?
No, I have to clarify when you meant surgical process. Do you mean the drilling of the hole?
The drilling, yes.
Yeah, yes, sir. He had said that when he had confessed to the police, he felt he'd given the essentials of who he killed, the numbers of people, and so on. And he said, however, that he was embarrassed about this part. I know that can sound incredible with all the other things he's done, but nonetheless, he admitted that when he talked to the police, and I did look at the confession, that he had initially told them that the holes were made after death, and that was a way in which he, and again, I feel bad saying this, but removing the brains to get at the skulls, he admitted to me, no, it wasn't after death, it was before death, and talked about this zombie-like state between life and death that I just told you about.
But it was after drugging them?
Yes, sir. They were drugged. None of these people, I mean, it's obviously awful, but thank God at least they weren't consciously aware of this. They were all unconscious, and he did it at that time.
We'll go back to some of the other things he told you, but I want to ask you his pattern of going around looking for victims. Is there a word that's described for that? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's several words, cruising, even in animals, they've used a word like stalking to talk about what happens when a drive begins to be active. If you've ever seen a picture of an animal that's, well fed and so on, he's just lying there quietly, when the animal becomes hungry, he then kind of gets into a predatory state. He starts looking around. He's trying to obtain prey. If there's a distraction, he has to move on somewhere else. If he is in a situation where he can't get it to prey, it just continues maybe for hours until finally he's able to satisfy that drive. A similar phenomenon has been described in human beings who have paraphilic disorders. Again, what I think is a driven behavior, driven by the sex drive, where, for example, I'll give a couple of examples that I hope will make it clear. If it's not, please ask me more. But we see examples of voyeurs, for example.
Voyeurs, explain what voyeurs are.
So-called peeping Tom. Again, anybody, in fact, lots of guys, if they passed a window and there happened to be an attractive woman, would probably look. But the average man is not having recurrent, intense, sexually arousing fantasies and urges about doing that. And we've seen in studying and working with paraphilics a group of people where that becomes the major sexual preoccupation. And they spend hours and hours and continually engage in this kind of behavior to the point where they, maybe even in the face of being arrested again, continue on. And the cruising that we're talking about here is the sort of going and seeing if they can find a window to look in. And again, if they're distracted, then because of the distraction, they'll move elsewhere. If they've started to look and perhaps they notice a neighbor, then they need to move to another window. It's been described in exhibitionists who seem to have this sense of needing to expose, and yet there are certain external controls that make it difficult, so they have to continue moving on and eventually do it. So that phenomenon has been called cruising. It's one of the things that we look for as warning signs when we're treating patients. Are they beginning to go out, to place themselves in vulnerable circumstances, starting a process, a pattern that may ultimately lead to the fuller expression of their behavior?
Well, what about, you were talking about pedophiles, men who have these intense feelings for children.
Well, again, the same thing. We're looking, again, in treating that. Are they starting to kind of go out to areas, let's say, like schoolyards? Perhaps they're rationalizing and telling themselves, well, I'm just walking by. I'm not really going to do anything. But then the next step is they get a bit closer. Perhaps they get nervous because a policeman walks by. They leave there, but then they start going down to the local playground. Those are all aspects, again, of what we call cruising, the preliminary behavior that you tend to see here. And certainly if you're treating people, things that you want to be looking for to try to figure out how to keep them from getting into that pattern that's likely to lead to even more escalated and dangerous activity.
How do you connect what Mr. Dahmer was doing, the nexus between what you've just described and Mr. Dahmer on this concept of cruising?
Well, again, I used other examples, and let me, if I may take a moment, when I use some of the examples like voyeurism and so on, I don't mean to trivialize. Obviously, what Mr. Dahmer did was much, much more serious. I may use some other examples because I'm seeing my role as trying to educate and help people be able, out of their own life experiences, to appreciate what it is that we experts feel we're seeing in someone like him. So I'm not saying that in every way, and it's just common sense, that Mr. Dahmer's like the driven exhibitionist or the driven pedophile, but the common feature is this driven nature of the behavior. And so we would expect in Mr. Dahmer, for example, to see that he would be going places, that if there were obstacles in terms of the drive and the fantasies and the urges, that he might move from this place to that. But tragically, ultimately, we would expect in a person, if these are very intense drives and urges who's not been treated, that he's likely to fully enact these in real life.
The behaviors that you're talking about relative to Mr. Dahmer, as you have expressed them to be a mental disease, mental illness, is just, could he be considered just a man misbehaving? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I mean, look at that. I mentioned earlier, we don't want to say that everybody that does something wrong has an illness. That would be a terrible thing to start excusing misbehavior by calling it illness. So we look very carefully at this. But, the situation here, and I think it's probably obvious, I don't think the normal man could even force himself to walk around thinking about having sexual contacts with dead bodies, with parts of dead bodies, could even begin to get himself into a aroused state, having those things on his mind. And yet here's a man who is preoccupied with these thoughts to the point where they become the entire way of life for him. To argue this is just some guy choosing an alternative lifestyle, it seems to me, is an argument I can't imagine can be sustained. I think he's afflicted with these recurrent urges and fantasies, that it is a terrible sickness. I remember one of my patients describing it himself, called it a cancer of the mind. It's a broken mind. So I don't think this is, and the guy deciding to misbehave. I think it's a much, much more complicated picture than that.
How about the fact of the simply choosing to think about these necrophilic urges and fantasies, or is it more complicated than that? Is it a matter of choice?
Well, again, you're asking me now about the thoughts that run through his head and not the behaviors yet at this point.
That's correct.
So I'll address that. Yeah.
Are we speaking in a general area or to objection to a particular individual here?
I think I said Mr. Dahmer. Mr. Dahmer simply choosing to think about these necrophilic urges and fantasies, or is it more complicated?
Well, it's more complicated if I can. I'll wait to see, because I'm saying I'm not supposed to say. But what I was going to do to try to explain Mr. Dahmer's situation is to relate it to some research, some studies, some things that have come out of my experience in this area. And I better wait and make sure, I suppose.
Go ahead, you can.
Is that okay? Sure. Okay. The idea that we can just always choose what is going to be on our mind, it isn't that simple. For example, in the face of strong feelings, affective experiences.
What do you mean by affected?
Affect, feelings, emotions, sexual arousal would be an example, to try to keep it specific here. Sometimes people find that it's difficult to extrude, to put out of their mind certain thoughts. For example, in depression, we see people who begin to ruminate about bad things happening to themselves. They begin to think their body's falling apart. They begin to think that they're going to be headed for financial ruin. They have all sorts of depressing thoughts, and try as they may, they just can't get them out of their mind. It's not that you can just give them a little kick in the behind and they can stop doing it. These severely depressed people, and we, in the course of my work, of course, see them, just complain that in the midst of the depression, they can't stop thinking about these depressing ideas. Another example to the point, and again, I'll stick to biological drives. There were studies to address this issue done, I think it was during the Second World War. They took conscientious objectors, people who for religious reasons didn't want to fight, but wanted to help the country in other ways. And they did some experiments, and we can debate whether they should have or not, but they did, where these people agreed to be starved, and they looked at the physical effects of starvation and the mental effects. When these people were starved, they couldn't get food off their mind. That's all they would think about. They would scheme in their mind about ways to get it. They would draw pictures of food. And then when they eventually fed them and relieved the hunger that was driving these fantasies, their mind was freed up for other things. That, we believe, is the kind of phenomenon that we can see in the severe instance of the paraphilic, that because there is a powerful biologically based drive behind this, they can be preoccupied with fantasies and urges. In fact, one of the treatments, which lowers the hormone that fuels the sex drive, when we give that, what people report is that they're then relieved from these fantasies and urges, and their mind is freed up in another way. So I don't mean to belabor it, but these are examples that it's not always so simple as just stop thinking about it, it'll go away. I think it's much more complicated than that.
Do you believe that a normal person, and I'm obviously when I say do you believe, I'm talking about as an expert, do you believe that a normal person could even ever be able to indulge himself in the kind of ideas that Mr. Dahmer had?
Yeah, I think we touched on that, and who knows what exactly a normal person is, but certainly the average individual, if I said to any folks, look, you've got to spend most of your time, or even a lot of your time, thinking these thoughts, and gee, you got to try to get yourself sexually aroused, and you got to go, and I don't want to keep repeating the kinds of behaviors that we're talking about here. God, I can't imagine that the normal person can do that, let alone them walking around just having those thoughts and urges continually running through the mind and having to struggle with how to deal with it.
In your medical opinion, was Mr. Dahmer behaving the way he did simply because it was exciting and pleasurable?
Well, it is exciting. The feelings he feels are exciting and pleasurable. And one way to interpret it, so somebody could say, well, you know, if he does it because it's exciting and pleasurable, that just means he's bad. That would be one interpretation. But the other observation is that when something is exciting and pleasurable, it can be difficult to stop doing it. I mean, that's the difficulty here, is that he is behaving in ways that are exciting and pleasurable, very, very exciting. It's occurring in relationship to a powerful drive. So absolutely it's exciting and pleasurable, but it's difficult for him for that reason to stop. If I can give an example, I've often tried to think, what would it be like to have a craving and to sort of have thoughts of having to do something? And I think one thing many of us can relate to, and again, I'm just trying to help us understand it. I'm not saying this is it, but if any of us have ever had to void very badly, that tends to be all we start to think about. And if we're in public and it's going to be embarrassing, we can kind of defer it a bit, and we try to find a place to do it where nobody's looking. And when we do it, it feels really good. It feels really pleasurable. But to think we were just having fun would be to miss the point, because there was a tremendous discomfort pressing us to do that thing which was pleasurable in the first place. Now, that's the phenomenon that I think we're dealing with here. I don't want to trivialize it, though. I'm not saying that what he did is like voiding, so I hope nobody's misunderstanding. But I'm trying to capture what I, as someone who has experience in this area, think a person like this is dealing with.
Well, what other kind of biological things of that nature can you use to further express this what was going through Mr. Dahmer that maybe we can relate to on this exciting and pleasurable concept?
I think there are many examples. And again, please remember, I'm not saying he's like that, but just to answer your question,
speculating about other things, this is to apply to a particular defendant.
Well, I think it's a foundation question to express what he's trying to convey here, Your Honor, as to Mr. Dahmer's state of mind when he was doing the things he was doing.
Objection overruled.
Okay, and again, I'll try very hard to relate it to Mr. Dahmer. I'm just trying to make the point that there are craving disorders, that we do see disorders where people are preoccupied with strong urges, strong desires that cause them great difficulty in terms of managing their behavior. It's not something that's just being made up because someone's in trouble. Other examples would be, let's say, the severe alcoholic who just has cravings and thoughts on their mind very often about giving into alcoholism. There are examples in psychiatry such as anorexia nervosa.
What is that?
Okay, that would be another example of a disorder that I, as a psychiatrist, would see, which on the surface, because I've been asked to make it, apply it to Mr. Dahmer, if someone knew nothing about this condition, anorexia nervosa and bulimia, and you were just watching a person, it might look as though they're simply choosing to do things that they could completely control. So let me explain the condition and how that relates. Anorexia nervosa is a condition that usually affects females. And they can have this intense sense of needing to remain thin, even though they may look like somebody out of a concentration camp. And the kind of things you would see in these women who have this intense desire to stay thin, if you looked at them, would look very sneaky and even dangerous. Remember, they can die from the condition. But if you don't watch them, in treatment, you have to watch them. They sneak off. They throw up the bulimia in order to keep food out of them, to keep their weight down. They sneak off somewhere and exercise if you're not watching them. There's such an intense pressure for these young women to do this thing, to do whatever they need to do. It'd be various things to keep the weight down, that they seem driven. And unless you watch them in order to try to get their weight up to where they're healthy, they can get themselves into serious trouble. If you understand what's going on, that this is a psychiatric disorder, that people can be impaired out of the kinds of drives that they're having, then it doesn't look so much like they're just choosing to be bad people or be sneaky. We realize what it is that's pushing them and why it is they need treatment.
How about Mr. Dahmer having normal sex? How is that consistent or inconsistent with your diagnosis of necrophilia?
There's a distinction that's made, and I'll try very hard to stay away from jargon because I don't like psychiatrists that speak mumbo jumbo, but one of the distinctions...
He hasn't linked it to talking with this man at all or what was said, and I object to his... You can't tell what he's talking about. This man doesn't have anorexia nervosa, a whole wide range. He hasn't linked it to this defendant, and I object to it as being irrelevant.
And I would like to say that the doctor under the statute is entitled to make that, and I am entitled to ask the questions in the form I want and not in the form that someone else chooses, unless the court is going to say that a foundation is not laid by this doctor based upon what he's told us at this point to continue his dialogue as to the mental condition of Mr. Dahmer.
Objections overruled.
Could you repeat the question? Sorry, I got distracted. What was the question?
What about the fact that Mr. Dahmer, you learned, and Mr. Dahmer made statements to you about the fact that he did have normal sex as he viewed normal sex?
Okay. The paraphilias can be divided in many ways, but the division that's relevant here would be called the exclusive form or the non-exclusive form. In the non-exclusive, let me start with the exclusive. In the exclusive form of paraphilia, the only kinds of thoughts or behaviors that will be sexually exciting or arousing are the paraphilia itself. In other words, if we took the exclusive form of pedophilia, only thoughts and behaviors with children would be sexually arousing. Thoughts about adults, behaviors with adults wouldn't be. It's exclusively paraphilic. There's no normal sexual behavior that even seems possible. In the non-exclusive form, the individual can experience some degree of normal sexual feelings, but in addition to that, they experience strong, recurrent, erotically arousing fantasies and urges of a deviant nature. The fact that you're capable of having normal sex doesn't erase the fact that you're still afflicted with these abnormal cravings and that giving into the temptations of the abnormal cravings may cause all sorts of troubles. There is evidence that Mr. Dahmer probably had some, quotes, normal sex, and so he's capable of it, but to think that that erases all the rest of this and that therefore the rest of it isn't relevant would be very much a mistake.
Do all psychiatrists agree that necrophilia is a psychiatric illness?
Well, let me address that. I don't know if all psychiatrists agree about anything, but let me talk about psychiatric illness, perhaps, and define it, and then at least we'll know what I mean by it, and we can talk about where people would or wouldn't agree. Is that a reasonable way to respond to your question?
Please.
Okay. One of the things that perhaps isn't readily appreciated is that whenever we talk about whether or not something is an illness, we really have to apply a certain value decision to that. And to make it clear, let me explain. Let's start with physical medicine, then I'll come directly to this. But if somebody came from Mars, for example, and I wanted to talk about different kinds of physical phenomenon, I could talk about two things. I could talk about, for example, cancer, and I could talk about respiration, breathing. Those are two different biological processes. And they could just be studied in their own right, and we wouldn't have to make a value judgment about it. We don't like cancer, though. It causes suffering. It impairs function. And so we add a label to that particular process, as we call it a disease. It causes a state of disease. We don't like it. We want to eliminate it. We want to understand it and intervene and do something about it. And so that kind of process we say is a disease. The same kind of value judgments have to be made when it comes, and I'll try to be very specific here, to the area of human sexuality. And it'll get into how psychiatrists can sometimes disagree and even change their mind. Again, if I came from the planet Mars and was just looking at the spectrum of human sexuality, I could say there are certain human beings for whom thoughts and behaviors with members of the opposite gender are erotically arousing. That's heterosexuality. There are men, stick to men, who are attracted sexually to women. Okay, that's one kind of observation I would make about human sexuality. I could then make another observation, having put no value on it, that there are some human beings who aren't attracted sexually to members of the same gender. They are sexually aroused in response to thoughts or behaviors of the same gender. And I could say, well, I want a label for that kind of sexuality, and I'd say that's homosexuality. It doesn't mean one's better or worse than the other. It means they're two different kinds of sexuality. Now, at one time, doctors put a value judgment on and said, we don't like homosexuality. We think it keeps you from having a heterosexual lifestyle. We think it's bad. They called it a disease. Ideas changed over time. Values changed. Everyone hasn't changed their mind, but the psychiatric profession said, our values are changed. We won't call it a disease. Now, there's still two very different things. It's still very different to this man from Mars that some people are attracted to members of the same gender and some the other gender. There's still a very different phenomenon, but now we said one isn't a disease. Now, to come specifically to Mr. Dahmer, here's another very different aspect of human sexuality. Here's a man that's walking around having intense, recurrent, erotically arousing fantasies and urges where the theme is about having sex in the way that we have already described. That's very different than anything I've described yet. That's yet another aspect of human sexuality. Now we have to make the value judgment. Is this something that we as doctors want to call a disease? Would psychiatrists say this is a disease? Well, if this isn't mental illness from my point of view, I don't know what is. And so I'm very comfortable talking about this as something that causes great suffering, that has great impairment, that if something's going to be called mental illness, this should be called mental illness. And I certainly don't have any difficulty in making that argument. Are there going to be doctors who are going to say this isn't mental illness? Maybe, but I think that's a pretty difficult point of view to try to defend.
You consider whether or not, did you consider when you were talking about these differential diagnoses, whether or not Mr. Dahmer is just generally antisocial in his behavior? Defining for us what antisocial is.
Yeah, again, I've raised this in other ways before. We're not just looking to get people off the hook. There are people that do bad things, and it's not because there's some kind of mental impairment. There's nothing, again, metaphorically speaking, that suggests their mind is broken or in some fashion. So we looked at that issue very closely, and that's, again, part of our diagnostic process. When we evaluate anyone, including Mr. Dahmer, to keep it specific, we evaluate issue A. What are they like in terms of the sexual phenomenon they're experiencing and in terms of their ability to cope with those sexual experiences? That's one issue. From issue B, what are they like in terms of their character, their temperament, their personality, and so on? It's very important to make that distinction because to the average person, the distinction might not seem to be there. In other words, if I said to you, here's a man, and I'll get specific to him, but just as an example, here's a man who's had sexual involvements repeatedly with 8-year-old boys. You might assume he's characterologically flawed. That may or may not be so. When we diagnose a sexual deviation disorder like pedophilia, we talk about the orientation that the person has sexually. We don't know if they're kind or cruel, caring or not caring, and so on. That has to be evaluated independently. So if we put aside for the moment, and obviously it's just for the moment, it's very important, the fact that Mr. Dahmer has these kinds of sexual experiences and acted on them, and look at all other aspects of his life and ask, is this a guy who seems to be generally criminally motivated? Is this a guy that would be a big-time troublemaker for the community? To try to get at this other issue of what the rest of his personality and temperament like. We see he drinks, and there's been some disorderly conduct. He one time made a gesture to a police officer and so on. But there's no evidence, and we get away from this general area we've been talking about, that in other ways he would be some big problem for the community. So we looked at that. We tried to decide, is that a major factor in what we're seeing? We decided, no, there's some things there, but the real issue seems to be what I've been talking about.
You use the word "we" a lot. When you say "we," you're talking about yourself.
I don't mean the royal we. I apologize. I'm talking about people who have my expertise would approach it in this fashion. Obviously, in this case, I'm talking about decisions that I made.
All right. Did you consider whether or not Jeffrey Dahmer might be psychotic? And before you answer that, define for us the word psychotic as it's used in your profession.
Right. Okay, there are different kinds of mental illnesses, and I may want to talk about rationalization too, because it's going to tie in here. But the answer to your question first, so I've answered the question, is absolutely. We considered whether or not Mr. Dahmer was psychotic, because that's going to be important. That is another kind of mental disease. It could be relevant to the issues at hand.
I'm stopping you. You said "we" again. Are you talking?
Okay. I'm sorry. That's a bad habit. Please interrupt me if I do that. Okay, what would be an example then of a psychotic illness that I considered in evaluating Mr. Dahmer? One example would be an illness such as schizophrenia. And again, years ago, there were misunderstandings. Those people with this disorder were choosing an alternative lifestyle. So what is schizophrenia as a psychotic illness? Schizophrenia is a mental illness where people become impaired in a particular way. They become hallucinated. They lose the ability to perceive reality accurately. They hear voices when no one's speaking. There's no sounds coming in their ear, but they report hearing voices. They become delusional. They lose the ability to reason rationally. They're absolutely convinced there are messages on the television specifically to them, and no amount of attempt to reason with them rationally convinces them. It's a fixed delusional belief that stuff on the television is a message to them from somebody. So they become delusional. They become disorganized in their thinking. These kinds of mental impairments that tend to go together tend to have a particular age of onset, they have certain family history, and so on. So we looked at that. I looked at that. One of the things that I particularly was concerned about is that Mr. Dahmer was talking about things like watching television VCR movies and seeming to relate. And I was concerned whether he was getting messages from the TV in a sense. He was talking about putting in yellow contact lenses and walking around looking like people that he'd seen in the movies. So I began to wonder. But as I pressed him, because I needed to get the truth here, what it turned out was he seemed very perplexed in trying to understand these thoughts, these urges he'd been having for so many years, how it was he would give it in and was acting on them, and began to have thoughts like wondering whether he was the devil, wondering whether there were forces that were pushing him to do it. But it was just at the level of wondering. He wasn't really hearing voices. They weren't really delusional beliefs. He certainly wasn't disorganized in his thinking. So I looked at it and I decided he does not have that particular kind of mental illness. He's not psychotic. I mean, he didn't have the other kind, but he didn't have that. He did, though, and this is closely related, have the kinds of rationalizations and denial that we see when people have craving disorders. He wasn't so deluded that he completely lost the ability to be in contact with reality, but there were certainly major distortions, as we so often see in the paraphilias, in his thinking. Again, any of us know these distortions. The person that's been smoking for years and seems unable to stop, and someone just tells them they have lung cancer, and they run out and get another cigarette, sort of convincing themselves, well, this one more cigarette isn't really going to, it's not really the smoking and so on. So he wasn't psychotic, but he did have a lot of rationalizing and denying.
Was his rationalization the kind of rationalization that we see in other people afflicted with holisms?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I suppose, the point of me coming as an expert witness, to try to make a determination of whether, in terms of the body of literature and my reading and my experiences, this seems to be a phenomenon that really exists, that some guy isn't just making it up when he's in trouble. And we certainly see that in almost all of these, what I'm calling craving disorders. People, and gosh, you have to be so careful in these settings not to tie other people in a way that would be misunderstood. But if you take, the alcoholic, a wonderful person like Betty Ford, she didn't clearly see that she was having this problem. She was rationalizing, denying. Her family had to kind of sit her down and force her to see it. And then, of course, as she developed the insights and was forced to see it out of her own motivations, she began to look at it differently. That's the kind of a thing I'm saying I saw in Mr. Dahmer. It's the kind of thing that one who's experienced in the area anticipates can be there in the paraphilias. And so even though he wasn't psychotic, there was a tremendous amount of that in terms of his thinking.
Yeah, you're talking about and trying to give us examples of something that we may know on an everyday basis, but tell us about his craving. What was his craving?
Well, again, I made the point. It's obviously not, well, he does have an alcohol problem, so I better not give that as the example. But his craving is what we talked about. His craving, the intense urges and fantasies with which he's preoccupied are this theme about finding someone in a live state, beginning to relate to them, continuing on in this transition state between life and death, continuing, talking about kissing and having gentle sex and be affectionate with people after they've died, relating to parts of their body after they're dead in a sexual way, thinking that by consuming them he's sustaining the relationship. These are the sick kinds of cravings and fantasies and desires that we're talking about specifically in this particular instance.
What other psychiatric diagnosis would you make about Mr. Dahmer to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty other than necrophilia?
Well, the other major one that I would make would be alcoholism. I think he's also an alcoholic.
Do you think he drinks can you tell us, in your opinion, does he drink to lower his inhibitions to carry out the object of his cravings?
Let me answer it, so I'm not avoiding the question. No, but if I can explain a bit. One of the things that a person like myself needs to do, who's been trained in psychiatry, is to try to be as objective as possible and to make a distinction between what is an observation and what is an interpretation. And one of the papers I've written, I think, makes this point clearly in terms of a brief parable. So if it takes 15 seconds, I think it'll make my point. In this parable about trying to be objective, I used the example of two priests and a bishop. And the first priest says to the bishop, "Father, is it all right if I smoke while I pray?" And the bishop says, "I'm sorry, my son, that's not permitted." The second priest says to the bishop, "Father, is it all right if I pray while I'm smoking?" To which the bishop says, "Of course, my son, of course." The point was exactly the same question. Can you do two things together? The answer really just depended on how the bishop interpreted it or saw it. Now, to bring it to the point here, some people have said Mr. Dahmer gets drunk in order to allow himself to become disinhibited and act. Mr. Dahmer's even said it. He's interpreted his behavior that way. Mr. Dahmer's an alcoholic. He drinks many times before he's done this. He's drank many times while he's done it. He's drank many times after he's done it. To think that this is just alcoholism would be ridiculous. Lots of people have serious alcohol problems and they don't do anything like this. To think that if Mr. Dahmer just stopped drinking, he'd be safe. Look, he's not drinking anymore, ladies and gentlemen. Let's let him be. He's a safe guy, would be incredibly naive. Drinking complicates his problem. There's no doubt about that. But this is a serious disease in my judgment, even without that problem. And it's that disease that's the major issue that I think we're dealing with.
Have you given any thought to whether or not you can pinpoint the cause of this necrophilia?
Yeah, I mean, people are doing research where it'd be terribly important to find out how does someone end up with this affliction to try to keep other Jeffrey Dahmers from developing. So I have, and I guess there's three things I can say about cause, and the first point is what it's not due to, and that may be even the most important point, and that is that this condition is not due to a voluntary decision. In other words, the sexual desires that even normal people experience are not there because they sit down as little children and weigh their options. In other words, I didn't sit down as a little kid and say, do I want to be a person who experiences attraction to women when I grow up, or do I want to be a man who experiences attraction to men? I discovered in growing up that my attraction is to women. I didn't decide it. And in our society with its various biases and so on, it's been an easier life having been able to make that discovery. Similarly, someone like Mr. Dahmer didn't sit down when he was 5, 6, 7 years old and say, gee, I wonder if I should be like everyone else in my sexual makeup, or no, there's a bunch of other choices and I think I'm going to pick this one out. He nobody would ever decide to have this kind of affliction. He discovers that he's afflicted with these recurrent, erotically arousing fantasies and urges of the most sick sort. And in that sense, and I mentioned it earlier, to me, it's about as clear an example of a mental illness as one could want to see. Now, that's what it isn't due to. Well, what is it due to? There's a lot of research looking for the causes of the various paraphilias. Some of the research looks at biology. None of us are interested in having sex because we read a book that says, we think about it, that's a logical idea. I mean, the fact that we experience sexual desires, that we have sexual thoughts in the first place, is tied to the fact that we're biological in our makeup. So there is some evidence, I won't go into a lot of detail, that sometimes some people seem to be predisposed to develop abnormal kinds of sexual cravings because something's gone wrong at the level of biology. The other thing that influences sexual development is certain kinds of early life experiences. Tragically, sometimes, particularly boys, if they've been abused sexually in early life, that abuse warps their subsequent sexual development, and they end up with abnormal kinds of sexual cravings. They're more at risk of having a paraphilia. So that's also been looked at. In this case, we haven't found particular evidence of abuse. We haven't really found a biological explanation. But whether we found the cause or not, whether we know that lung cancer is caused by cigarette smoking, or we don't know what the heck it's caused by, lung cancer is still lung cancer, and this is still necrophilia, even in the absence of a clear understanding of how it got to be that way in the first place.
So you don't have to know the cause in order to say it's a disorder.
No, absolutely not, and I won't go on. This is a clear case in point in my judgment.
You have an opinion to a degree of psychiatric certainty based upon the things that you've done relative to testifying here, that Mr. Dahmer has merely chosen to live differently than virtually all other human beings, or is he the victim of a psychiatric affliction?
Well, I probably covered that. I think I answered that. I believe he's got a genuine psychiatric affliction.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty that once Mr. Dahmer became aware of his necrophilic cravings, that he could stop those cravings and the object of those cravings by just willpower alone?
My opinion is he couldn't, and it would be important to explain that, because I think that can be a difficult concept for people to understand. The law assumes, and indeed it must make that assumption, I think, that anybody can do whatever they want if they just put their mind to it. Because if the law didn't make that assumption, we would have absolute chaos. I suppose any criminal who's just robbed a bank could come into a court of law and make the ridiculous argument that he was so overpowered by feelings of greed that he just couldn't control himself, and he's sick, he's not a criminal, and so on. And that's nonsense. So we have to assume that in general, or at least most of the time, people can control their behavior, can conform their conduct to the requirements of law, which is really the fundamental issue we're addressing here. The only problem is, and I'm speaking now as a physician, that often that simply isn't the case. And now again, I want to make some examples here talking about how it is just for ordinary people. And I just want to do that is trying to teach people and help them understand the concept. I'm not saying that's yet Mr. Dahmer, but having talked about it in ordinary people, I then want to talk about how it can be even so much more magnified a problem in someone who has necrophilia. So if I can do that, I would like to.
Go ahead.
Okay, let me give you, and I'll stick to the biological drives, because we're talking here about something that I believe is fueled by a biologically based drive. Let's start first with thirst, another kind of biologically based drive. There was an interesting study done several years ago, actually at Johns Hopkins Hospital, on people who were being made thirsty by renal dialysis. These are people, they have bad kidneys. Because they have bad kidneys, they have to be dialyzed. They have to go on a machine, because if they're not dialyzed, they'll die. Going on that machine makes them thirsty, but because they have bad kidneys, if they drink too much between treatment sessions, they can get very sick or even kill themselves. So to try to put into a forensic context, the doctor's law is don't drink too much fluid between treatment sessions. The penalty is you can get very sick, you could even die. And this was just a simple study. They looked at how many of those people, good people, just sick people, patients, obeyed the doctor's law. And they found out none of them did. And then they looked to see why. It can't be because they're bad people. So they looked at different possibilities, and they found out that what predicted the extent of drinking between treatment sessions was how thirsty the dialysis procedure made you. The more thirsty you were made by dialysis, the more likely you were to drink to break the law. Another biologically based drive is hunger. Millions of Americans now are spending an absolute fortune trying to control their behavior. And there's increasing evidence that, at least for some people, that nature is determining where weight should be, that right to the calorie, nature is deciding what you should take in. And you're, in a sense, in many cases, fighting nature when you try to change that. What does the person who's trying to diet describe? And to relate it to what Mr. Dahmer describes in a moment. I think we probably all know this if we stop to think about it. The kind of thing a person can describe is that when I'm not hungry, let's say I've just had a big meal and I come to the doctor's office, I say, look, I think I'm going to be able to handle this. I'm going to be able to diet. Then people begin to get discomforted by their hunger. They start to rationalize. They start to kid themselves. This one pretzel, this piece of candy, this isn't really going to be so bad. They then premeditatedly and often sneakily go somewhere. They get up out of bed, they go to the refrigerator, they go down to the candy machine, whatever. They're discomforted by this hunger. They go somewhere and get something. Having eaten and reduced their drive, they're sorry, and they're sorry. They promise never again to do it, and yet as they begin to be discomforted by their cravings, they repeat the pattern. Patrick Carnes, the psychologist, I think was the first to make the point that the same thing can happen with this other biologically based drive, sex. He used the term sexual addiction. Now, I'm just trying to make the point that even with normal people, that it can sometimes be the case, not always, but in a number of instances, that even when someone's trying their best to control their behavior in a particular way, they may not, through their own willpower, be able to succeed. That's the phenomenon that I'm trying to get across to people here. And if it's that way, even for some normal people, imagine what it might be like for somebody constantly preoccupied with the kind of sick urges and cravings of the sort we've been discussing here earlier.
So your answer is, as far as Mr. Dahmer trying to do it by his willpower alone, he couldn't do it.
In my judgments, Mr. Dahmer is unable at this point in his life to stop himself, to walk away from it. So I'm not even suggesting that with treatment he'd be safe on the street, but the idea that this man out on the street wouldn't be succumbing once again to these urges and cravings, that his own willpower is enough to help him walk away from it. My conclusion is, and I've tried to explain the logic of how I've come to this conclusion, is that he couldn't. And again, to make the logic clear, in case it hasn't been, I'm saying even in normal situations, some people, simply through their own willpower, can't control their behavior, even some normal people. I'm saying in the paraphilic disorders, there can always be some degree of difficulty for a person controlling their behavior. I'm saying in the extreme or most serious forms of paraphilia, that impairment of ability to control is going to reach the point where they're simply not, without proper treatment, going to be able to succeed. And I'm saying this is about as serious a case of a paraphilia as I think most of us are ever going to see.
Can you give us some examples based upon your medical expertise and clinical expertise of how psychiatric conditions can cause a person to lack substantial capacity to be able to conform their conduct to the requirements of law or the requirements of anything?
Well, again, we've covered a bit, but I'll give another paraphilia that I think some of
this man is just running without any response to questions, and it makes it impossible to object. He just in and out, over raising new subjects on his own. I'll object to the form of this long narrative questions.
And I think it's inappropriate that this expert who has been qualified can't take the time to educate a jury in the fashion that he is. He's subjected to cross-examination, and I think it's unfair to say that this doctor isn't being responsive to my questions. So I would ask to be allowed.
Let me have the last question, Rick.
And the start of his answer.
Can you give us some examples based upon your medical expertise and clinical expertise, how psychiatric conditions can cause a person to lack substantial capacity to be able to conform their conduct to the requirements of law or the requirements of anything? The answer, well, again, we covered a bit, but I'll give another paraphilia that I think and I'm there.
Okay. You're going to overrule the objection to the question. However, let's make sure that the answer is responsive to the question.
But I'm asking you then again, you have defined what you know the law to be and the lack of substantial capacity for one to conform their conduct to the requirements of law. You have answered the question about Mr. Dahmer's mental illness, the disease as you have labeled it. How does a disease cause a person to lack substantial capacity? What's the connection between the disease and the substantial capacity concept?
Well, the point that I would make in response to that question is that we see many examples clinically of how a disease can cause a person difficulty in controlling their behavior simply through their own willpower. I'm trying to make the point that I've seen this clinically. It's real. It's not just something that someone's making up when they're in trouble. And that was the reason I was going to give another paraphilia as an example to make the point that a disease, a particular kind of paraphilia, is capable of causing a person to be impaired in their ability through their own willpower to control their behavior. The example I'm going to give, and I
go ahead.
It's okay to go ahead, was masochism. These are examples where a disease causes someone to, in a sense, be their own victim because of the fact that they're impaired in their ability to control themselves. The sexual masochist is someone who is recurrently experiencing arousing fantasies and urges about having themselves suffer, about having themselves injured. And because these can be such persistent and strong fantasies and urges, oftentimes these people, because they behave and act on these urges, have ended up dead. The FBI did a study on this, finding out numbers of people who weren't trying to commit suicide, but who, because of the strength of these masochistic urges and fantasies of putting themselves in positions of danger because it was so sexually arousing, and having an escape mechanism that they were going to want to use at the end, and getting so excited that they couldn't get the escape mechanism and got up dead. So that the point is that being the victim wasn't sort of the product of a criminal mind in a sense. It was the outcome of a person having a disease that was driving and driving and driving at them. That's really the point that I'm trying to, and I don't know if I'm doing well or not, but trying to help people understand. Okay.
How about Mr. Dahmer in regards to this concept and his mental disease and his lack of substantial capacity, as you've said it? Does he fall into that category?
Yes, in my judgment, he does fall into that category.
Do all paraphilias lack substantial capacity to control themselves or conform their conduct to requirements of law?
I think in all of the paraphilias we look at it, because potentially it can become an issue. So it does become a matter of degree. I've seen people at sort of the low end of the spectrum, if I can put it that way, that I don't think are so impaired that they're lacking substantial capacity. But in the more severe forms of the paraphilia, then one can be concerned that indeed they may be. And of course, clinically, we don't normally sit down and address that issue. It only becomes an issue where we're, in a sense, very much having to address the issue if the person does show up in a court of law.
And tell us, as far as you are concerned, based upon your knowledge and expertise as a psychiatrist, just how strong, how severe was Mr. Dahmer's disorder?
Perhaps, but I'll allow it.
Okay, I think what you're asking, correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to be off the point, but you're asking me to explain what I was finding in Mr. Dahmer that leads me to the conclusion that he's in that category. Is that?
No, I'm asking you just how severe was his disorder?
Well, if you're just asking me that, I think it was very severe.
I want to go on to Mr. Dahmer being afflicted with the mental disease, as you have told us, and the fact that he lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of law, as you have stated it. You have told us that the reason that he could not conform his conduct to requirements of law was because of his mental disease. Is that what you've said?
Well, I didn't say exactly that. I said that I felt he lacked substantial capacity to conform his behavior because of his mental disease.
All right. Now, what would have had to have happened for Mr. Dahmer as he was going along his spree of killing to suddenly regain, based upon your opinion to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty, to regain his ability to control his conduct? You understand my question?
Well, I'm trying to understand it. I'm talking about a person that I think has a disorder that's chronically present. I think it was severe even early on in terms of when we recognized it and it became worse. So I'm not quite sure if I'm understanding what you're asking.
Well, as Mr. Dahmer went along in these killings, what would have had to have happened for them to stop his regaining whatever capacity he had to stop? What would have had to occur? You can answer it. You're an expert.
The court will decide that, Mr.
Yeah, I think so. Mr. Boyle wants to help you out a little bit.
Let me rephrase the question.
Okay.
You're aware that Mr. Dahmer killed Mr. Hicks in 1978.
Yes, sir.
Do you know when he next killed? What year?
Yes, it was about 9 years later.
During that period of 9 years, based upon anything that you came to learn, based upon your conversations with Mr. Dahmer, based upon your reading whatever materials you read, which we'll get into later, did you come across any acts of violence committed by Mr. Dahmer as it relates to another human being? I'm talking about violence that is taking of life.
If you were asking me to restrict it to violence, I did not see any evidence that that had occurred.
His next act of violence took place in 1987.
That's correct.
You're aware of where it took place?
Yes, sir, in the Ambassador Hotel.
Subsequent to that time, there were 15 more victims.
That's correct.
You have rendered an opinion that Mr. Dahmer had lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to requirements of law.
Yes. Now, keeping in mind that the first killing in Ohio isn't an issue and that he's not being charged on the second crime, which would be the first one in Milwaukee, which was the Ambassador Hotel incident.
So your opinion you have expressed as to all homicides thereafter, that he was suffering from a mental disease.
That's correct.
And the result of which he lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to requirements of the law.
That is what I have said, yes.
Now, as he is going along this killing spree that he engaged in, what happens to his capacity to conform his conduct to requirements of law?
Well, I think it was severely impaired all along. I think at the time of the Ambassador killing, where he wakes up and finds that he's with the dead body, he really reached the point of feeling, and I can describe it later, that he kind of fought the good fight and was kind of overwhelmed and demoralized and kind of just gave in to the disease. And then I think as time went along from there on in, that the disease became progressively worse, that he became progressively more impaired as time went along.
And what would have had to have happened as he is going along for him to suddenly stop and not do it after the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh victim? Can answer it, Judge, as an expert. I think it's a fair question.
Yes, I'm going to allow it. The objection's overruled.
Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I do. I was just waiting to see
Go ahead.
how to answer it. In my judgment, Mr. Dahmer clearly, well, I shouldn't say clearly, in my medical opinion, Mr. Dahmer was out of control and was becoming progressively more out of control, and it wasn't going to be he who was going to stop it. It was going to have to be stopped by some outside force, which is exactly how it inevitably was stopped.
Are there medications that exist that are used in the treatment of paraphilias?
Yes, one of the definitions of a mental illness, not the only one, but many definitions of mental illness do talk about whether or not the condition in question requires treatment. There are medications that are used in treating these conditions, recognizing their driven nature and trying to decrease the intensity of the drive as a means of trying to increase a person's ability to be better in control of themselves.
It is clear, based upon what you have learned, that Mr. Dahmer, during the course of the years from 83 through 87 and even into 89 and in the 90, whatever, was in fact in a position where he was being observed by others, such as the court system and by probation officers and psychologists and, in fact, psychiatrists.
Well, I'm aware there were times when he was on probation. I'm aware there are doctors, that he's seen. I'm aware of the facts that you're describing.
Was he at any time, based upon what you've been able to learn, being treated with any kind of medication that would normally be dispensed by a psychiatrist for a person with a paraphilic or disorder?
No, he's never received treatment for this disorder. I think there was, as I mentioned earlier, denial and rationalization. I don't think at a certain point he even saw the need for it. I think he gave up at one point and wasn't even, the power of what was driving him basically took over, and he didn't have any interest in his own on seeking out treatment.
Did you discuss with Mr. Dahmer as to why he did not seek treatment for the paraphilic disorder or to stop these killings?
Yes.
What did he tell you?
He told me several things, and I also made several observations. It wasn't only a matter of what he told me, but he talked about. Let me back up on this. He did tell me there was a time when he was trying, so maybe I better put it in a historical sequence.
Please do.
Mr. Dahmer tells me, and again, he's told others, but I'll just talk about what he's told me. That he committed the first killing in Ohio, as we talked about earlier, when he was about 18 years of age. There'd actually been what I would call a near miss before this, where he'd been riding a bike and had a club and was thinking about it. Thank God didn't, but tragically then ultimately did the first killing in Ohio, and apparently was quite appalled at himself afterwards, and then went, as we've talked, for about 9 years fighting this. He went into the service where there was a lot of structure present for a couple of years, had some drinking problems, came out, went to live at his grandmother's house for a period of time, was going to church and praying and trying to do that. It was during that time period, after the first killing and between the second, where the examples I gave earlier came into play. He had thought about perhaps going to a cemetery and getting a body. He was still having these urges and desires, but that was something he thought might help him to not succumb to them. I gave the other example of the mannequin, and he took a mannequin from a store and again tried to do that. There was an incident that occurred during this period when he wasn't acting, where a man in a library approached him and propositioned him sexually. It also, he tells me, and it was my judgment, he was telling the truth on this, trying not even to get into the gay lifestyle. Ultimately, after that incident, although he didn't go with that particular man, he got back involved in the gay lifestyle. He ended up not killing, but starting to go and put things in the drinks of people at bathhouses and so on, so that they would be kind of in this half dreamlike state, but still not crossing the line of another death. And then apparently in a very intoxicated state, going to the Ambassador Hotel. And I think clearly the evidence supports it wasn't planned, because he had no escape plan. He hadn't arranged to be able to get rid of a body. Apparently wakes up in this drunken stupor with this man next to him dead, and there's no doubt in his mind who's killed him, but he says he doesn't remember, and I suspect he'd blacked out from intoxication and so on. And then he figured out a way, since the body was there, to ultimately get it out. And what he tells me at that point is that, he had, in a sense, fought the good fight. Here he is with this dead body. This disease was, he didn't use the word disease, I'm sorry, I want to be aggravated. These urges, this compulsion is the word that he would often use. It was overpowering him. Perhaps it was his destiny to do it. Maybe it was the work of the devil. He was perplexed and trying to understand it and totally demoralized. And at that point, I think really gave up trying and simply allowed the disease to go on unchecked.
Do you feel that that was his choice, was it not?
Okay, now I'm sorry?
That was his choice not to continue.
I think he was fighting very hard for many years, is the point I'm making, not to give in to these urges. I think, as I said, he became overpowered and demoralized and just, metaphorically speaking, was beaten by the disease and just ultimately gave up trying.
And without repeating the definition that I've asked you 3 or 4 times, it was at that juncture that he had a mental disease, as you have told it, and how it
I think he had the mental disease throughout, but certainly it was becoming more and more severe, and of course it was becoming more and more severe, more and more impairing. And so I'm describing a progressive disease that ultimately gets quite out of control.
You feel, based upon your knowledge and experience as a clinical psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a doctor running the sexual disorders clinic, that Mr. Dahmer was honest with you during the time that you were talking to him?
Fundamentally, during the time when I was talking to him, I think he was. I think he had been earlier on. As I said, there were some distortions in terms of what he'd said to people earlier. I was trying to look at whether he was honest. I was looking at what he'd told other people to see if it was consistent and try to make a judgment about how to weigh what he was saying. I mentioned earlier he'd held back in the confession about the drilling of the holes. But again, to answer your question, I'm cognizant of not getting off the point. The answer is yes. I felt that when I was speaking to Mr. Dahmer, he was essentially honest with me. That was my opinion.
Did Mr. Dahmer at any time try to point the finger at some other outside force that caused him to do this, or did he accept the responsibility?
He accepted. As I said, he was perplexed. He kind of wondered in a philosophical way about whether this was an evil force, the work of the devil. But, as I pushed him, I was trying to see, as I said earlier, if he was ill. He wasn't blaming it on that. He wasn't saying it was that. He was just trying to figure it out, but basically said, I'm responsible. I've got the answer to God, things of that nature.
You were aware of the fact of his confession?
I'm sorry?
You were aware of the fact of his confession?
Yes, sir. I had seen the confession prior to seeing him.
And did the things that you talked to him, were they consistent with his confession?
Yes, obviously, when there's this volume of material, people aren't going to have verbatim what they said before. In fact, it was verbatim. You'd wonder if they memorized it. But essentially, and I've already talked about some of the discrepancies, but essentially, he was telling me pretty much the same thing.
How about prior to him being arrested? Did you come to learn whether or not he had been honest in the past when he was dealing with people?
Yeah, that was an entirely different situation. He had been very dishonest. As I mentioned earlier, I think that he'd reached a point of giving up, of not even wanting help. I think he was in denial. I think he was, I won't repeat myself, but no, absolutely, he was not honest with a number of people with whom he'd been involved prior to the time that he had been apprehended.
Could he have been able, during the course of this paraphilia problem that he was having, to have been able to sustain himself by just engaging in other kind of self-abuse or other kind of self-conduct, such as masturbation or just looking at videos or things of that nature?
Goodness, I mean, if it was so simple that, by masturbating we could stop it, we could have, people would come into the office 3 times a day, we'd have them masturbate, and that would be the end of the problem. In fact, to the contrary, and I'm going to choose my words carefully, this isn't meant to be a sick pun, but there are many cases where masturbation can actually whet the appetite, in the long run increase the risk rather than decrease the risk that the person will act. So no, the idea that he kind of could have treated it himself by just masturbating more would be a very naive notion.
I don't want to, I'm going through some of my notes so I don't go over the same area. Okay. It is true, is it not, that at some time during the course of these years from 78 through 91, that Mr. Dahmer did try and stop, as you have expressed it, these paraphilic urgings? Does that in any way change your conclusion that at any other time he could have stopped?
Let me make sure I understand the question. It's a little complicated. I said that I thought he had tried for many years, and he claims that he did. And in fact, we know no evidence to the contrary. These people have looked very, very closely from around the country at whether he's done other homicides. So there's simply no evidence whatsoever that he's killed anyone other than the people that we know about. So that gives credence to the idea that he was able, and he did fight over many years successfully to control this. If I understood your question, I may not have. I think, are you asking me if the fact that he stopped trying changes my decision, or am I missing
Yes.
that? Okay. No, I mean, the issue really is, does he, as a result of this illness, lack substantial capacity? I think it's tragic that he reached a point where he felt so beaten down by the illness that he stopped trying. It would have been nice to even fight further, but that's not the issue. The issue is, even if he had been trying, would he have been able to succeed? Was he having an illness that substantially impaired his capacity to conform his behavior? So the fact that he stopped trying is sad. The fact that he got overwhelmed and quit, and so it is a shame, but it's not changing my opinion in terms of whether he had the disease or whether the disease became so severe as to cause him to lack substantial capacity.
Now, based upon everything you learned and everything you read, do you have an opinion as to whether or not, and based upon mostly talking to Mr. Dahmer, that his behaviors were in any way considered to be racially motivated or crimes of hate against people of different persuasion?
Yes, I have an opinion. Absolutely not. In fact, to make the point that in a sick sense, it's actually the contrary. My colleague John Money, in writing about the paraphilias, used the word love sickness and made the point that it's broader than only sexual arousal. It's also a sense of wanting to sustain a relationship, an intimate relationship with an individual that is being expressed in the paraphilias. And again, if we look at Mr. Dahmer, he was feeling that he wanted to be close to these people. In his sick thinking, somehow by eating them and ingesting them, he was closer. Somehow by continuing to caress them after death, he was sustaining the relationship. So in a very sick way, it's obviously sick to talk about this as wanting to maintain a relationship, but he really wanted a closeness. He wanted to be relating to these people. He wasn't hating them. He wasn't mad at them. He wasn't trying to torture them. He repeatedly talked about, and I know it doesn't diminish how awful it was, but his concern that they not be suffering, that they were all asleep when they ultimately died. So there isn't a shred of evidence that I've seen to suggest that these are hate crimes, that these are racially motivated crimes. Quite to the contrary, they're the sick crimes involving lust and even a distorted way of trying to maintain closeness in a relationship.
Did you determine the size and the physical structure and the age of the persons that were the object of his behaviors?
Yeah, they had a certain physique and build. What you'd expect. They were the kind of people that were attractive to him. He's not really dangerous to a woman. He's an extreme example because that's not the person that is in the fantasies. It's not the kind of preoccupation he has. These were really the reenactment of the fantasies. So it was a particular build and appearance. They tended to be young males. But again, he wasn't hating people because of color, any of that.
With the condition that you told us that Mr. Dahmer was suffering from, did he himself, as he's going along on these killing spree, does he understand his own motivations?
No, I think he really doesn't. There's many examples of that. For example, he said many, many times in each of the killings, not each of them, but in many of them, when asked why he killed them, he would say things like, I didn't want them to leave. I decided to kill them when they weren't going to leave. Those folks, if they'd have decided to stay, I'm afraid, tragically, were still going to end up dead. He was responding to these sick cravings. So his thinking that, gee, if they really would have stayed a little longer, everything would have been okay. I don't buy that at all. I'm not saying that's dishonesty. I said I thought he's being honest. But in terms of understanding it himself, and clearly we see confusions at times, and many times he talks about being overpowered by this compulsion and not being able to handle it, and then kind of wondering, well, gee, maybe there's evil forces that are doing it. He's very perplexed and does not have any real insight or understanding regarding his own disease.
I would like to ask you your opinion as to one making a claim that Mr. Dahmer would be simply evil, engaging in moral misconduct. Do you have an opinion as to whether or not that's what Mr. Dahmer was doing?
We looked, I looked very carefully at that. I might have phrased it slightly differently, but, one of the things we don't want to do I don't want to do, I'm sorry about this that I don't want to do as a physician or psychiatrist, and psychiatrists have been accused of doing, is I don't want to relabel sin as psychopathology and get someone off the hook, so to speak. So I want to be very careful not to have that happen. But having said that, I also want to be balanced and objective, and the mistake can occur in the other direction. I also don't want to take someone who clearly is very ill and impaired out of their illness and make the mistake that this is someone who's got a fully intact mind who's simply misbehaving. So I looked at both sides of that and even got into this concept of evil. One way of expressing it is, why'd he do it? Because he's evil. And, what tells us it's evil? Because he did it. It's sort of a label that masquerades as an explanation. It doesn't really explain anything. And then the other way is to try to see if science and medicine can help us have a better understanding. Is there knowledge out of the work we've done that tells us that there are diseases such as paraphilias? Is there knowledge out of the work we've done that says that people do have fantasies and urges? I mean, unless Mr. Dahmer called me up or read DSM-3R between the time in which he was arrested and gave his confession to find out what the DSM-3R said, his words are almost a textbook description. So my point is that I felt that there were pieces of information out of my knowledge and my expertise that would help me understand this as something a bit in a more sophisticated way than simply thinking it was evil. And again, to repeat, because I didn't want to lose it, I am rambling a bit. I did want to be sure we weren't excusing sin by calling it psychopathology, but I also wanted to be sure, and that was my final conclusion, that we weren't saying someone was simply misbehaving when indeed they were ill and very impaired out of that illness.
I only have a few more questions that just kind of cover up. They've been asked. Hopefully they're not so repetitious, but I still think they're necessary. Are the psychiatric opinions that you have rendered here today made to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty?
Yes, and I can summarize if you want why, but just to answer your question directly, yes.
Is the mental disease that you have ascribed to Mr. Dahmer, is that made to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty that he was suffering from that mental disease each and every one of the charged homicides, beginning with the one that took place after the Ambassador Hotel in 1987?
Yes, sir.
Is your opinion that he lacks substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of law on each and every one of those occasions made to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty?
Yes, sir.
Is your opinion that his substantial capacity was lacking because of the mental disease that you've ascribed to his condition made to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty?
Yes, sir.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty whether or not, as he progressed along this killing spree, his capacity was becoming more affected to a greater degree than the just prior to killing? You understand my question?
Yes, and I do have an opinion. I can tell you what it is, and if you want me or don't want, I can explain it depending on what you want. But I do have an opinion, and my opinion is that as time went along, the disease became more severe, that it was more progressive, and that because it became more severe, the impairment became progressively more severe.
Was the impairment ever absolute?
Let me answer it this way. No, not to the point of if a policeman was standing there watching him, he would have done it. But it certainly got very close to the point where he was doing it with the policeman almost standing there watching. And if you want me to explain that, I can do that.
When was it that his impairment got to the point? Well, strike that. If he did it when a policeman was there watching him, how severe then would the impairment have been?
Well, I hope it didn't get lost. Sort of said I have to decide about this concept of, he's got this disease. Does it cause him to lack substantial capacity? And nowhere did it say that he has to lack all capacity. I suppose if he was going to do it with the policeman standing there watching him, we'd have to say this is a person who had no capacity whatsoever. And I don't think that such a person exists. And if that were the criteria, I suppose we wouldn't be even in a court of law addressing the issue, because it'd be an issue that was moot.
But about a situation in regards to the Dahmer case, based upon what you have learned, when Mr. Dahmer's impairment affecting his capacity became so strong that you want to tell us about when it rose to that level with a policeman at his elbow?
Well, I'll describe, because I'm trying to give the people an understanding of how I thought about this so they can decide if it makes sense to them. Let's start with it's all tragic, as I say, the tragedies, but it's all tragic. But the tragic situation where the young Laotian boy, and I'm sorry, I'm afraid to stumble over his name, so I don't want to try it. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but the young Laotian boy was taken back into his house by the police officer who had no way of understanding what was happening. At that stage of things, Mr. Dahmer, at that point, was in a situation where he was on probation for a prior offense. There was a body lying in the other room when the policeman came in with this young boy. The police then brought the young boy back in. There was all sorts of concern in the community, so bunches of people knew that the last place that this young boy had been seen was going back with the police into this home. Mr. Dahmer then proceeded to kill that boy with the other body in place. He took no steps at that point to sort of lie low or to get out of there, the sense that people are right on his tracks. Again, the idea is that police are, who are they going to think did it if this young boy ends up not showing up? There were kind of all these witnesses. He proceeds on to the point where he's continuing again. He kills another fellow. He then brings in yet another man while there's a body actually in the bathtub. He lets it behind the shower curtain. The fellow he brings in goes to the bathroom, doesn't even realize there's a body there. Mr. Dahmer hasn't made absolutely sure that other guy isn't going to be able to leave. So that's going on. It's reached a point where he can't even maintain his job for a while. In spite of all this, he somehow managed to hold on to his job. To me, at this point, I mean, that's about as close as you can get to the policeman at the arm. The bodies were lying there decaying. The smell was awful. He was leaving the building unattended while bodies were laying there. Though that's a part of the evidence that I looked at, suggesting that he's reaching a point where he's virtually, not totally, but virtually totally out of control. Now, I said even earlier on, I think there was still some evidence. And by the way, if you drew a graph of the killings, it would just go up in an exponential way, compatible with the idea that someone's out of control. But even earlier on, for example, he had been awaiting a sentencing in an instance where he'd been charged with taking pictures, again, tragic irony of someone that turned out to be the brother of the Laotian boy I just talked about. He was on probation. Well, before he was on probation, he was charged with that. During the period of time between when he was charged with that and he was sentenced, he committed yet another killing and then took the skull from that killing and put it in his locker at work during work release because he needed to be close to it under circumstances where he's being watched closely, where that's evidenced, in that setting that's incredibly damaging. So even back then, we're not just having a guy who just seems to be sort of pulling it when he's under pressure and so on, but certainly by the end, where the bodies are piling up and so forth and so on, I think he was just about completely out of control at that point.
Doctor, the mental disease that you've stated, you called what again?
I called the disease necrophilia.
Did that disease, do you consider, in your expert opinion, that to be an impairment of the mind?
Well, I mean, if that's not an impairment of the mind, and I hope I'm not trying to sound snarky, but, if that's not an impairment of the mind, I don't know what is.
Does that impairment of the mind, is that an enduring or a transitory type of thing in the person of Jeffrey Dahmer?
It's clearly, in this case, been enduring and even progressive.
It's clearly which?
It's been both enduring and progressive.
Does that condition of the mind substantially, to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty, affect the mental and emotional processes of Mr. Dahmer at the time that he committed every one of these offenses?
Yes, sir.
Can you make that opinion to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty?
Yes, I mean, it's fundamental to his mental processes. We're talking about the mental processes themselves that are the very essence of what this is all about.
Doctor, did you have occasion to look at pictures that were taken, some virtually 500 3 more minutes. That's why I'm just finishing up now. I thought maybe
I'm looking for a breaking point.
I think I should just finish up. Okay, we can. Well, I tell you what, maybe it's a good time to break. I'll just double check my notes and then I won't have to do much upon return, but I think I can just 5 or 7 more minutes. I just don't want to say 5 or 7 more minutes. When we come back, I say I got 3 more questions. Why don't we break now, Judge?
Court in recess.
What place